Hello and welcome to this module of your online grant writing training. In this module, we'll be talking about evaluation and sustainability. I'm Diane Leonard and I'll be your training for this module. And a quick introduction into my background, in case you haven't been in any of the other modules yet, and this is where you're starting. Real quick, I'm a grant professional certified through the Grant Professional Certification Institute, and I'm an approved trainer of the Grant Professionals Association. Now let's see what else is here. I started as a grant maker, I'm a Scrum trainer, I'm a runner. None of these say that my expertise is evaluation. Yet, when we as grant professionals sit down to write a grant application, could be a small one, could be a large government application, we are very likely to have to talk about, write about, integrate into the rest of our application, how is it that our organization is going to measure the impact of the project or program, or maybe our organization as a whole, and report back to the funder. So in this module, we're going to focus on quantitative evaluation, then we'll look at qualitative. We'll talk about what it means to sustain and replicate our programs, our projects, and then we'll talk about scaling up and sharing knowledge. There are lots of additional resources. Evaluation is in its own right an entire profession. That's why, well, we've got the Grant Professionals Association. Evaluators have the American Evaluators Association, their own professional association just with this specialty. So in this module, let's be honest, we're going to scratch the surface of evaluation and we're looking at it from the lens of the grant professional. What do we need to know in order to write highly competitive grant applications? So as we think about evaluation and sustainability, there's one other very large elephant in this room. Okay, I know you can't see it behind me. That's why I had to put it on the screen for you. When we think about evaluation, I was pretty upfront about my background and my formal expertise. Well, what about your team and your expertise? It's one thing to say that we can write about evaluation, that we can talk about quantitative and qualitative data and what it is that we plan to do for measuring our impact. But do your colleagues have the capacity or do they have the expertise? Is there any possibility that without overflowing their plates, that your colleagues will be able to manage the evaluation or to design and implement the evaluation necessary for your project or program? This is a big question mark, and it's one that you should be thinking about for each and every grant application. Who do we have on staff, or what collaborative partners do we have that might have the ability to focus on our evaluation efforts? If we look internally, and we realize that we do have the capacity, we do have the expertise, that's great. Let's make sure that we include that in our total project or program budget. It is an important total cost of the program that we need to present within our grant budget. If, in looking at our resources, looking at our commitments and our expertise as a team, if we realize that actually there is not the capacity or there is not the expertise and we need to look outside our organization, we might want to look to a collaborative partner or an external evaluator. So maybe we look to an institution of higher ed, a partner, a professor that is in the same field of interest that would be able to support our evaluation efforts. That's something that many nonprofits do. Or perhaps, depending on the specific grant program that we're thinking about applying for, maybe we actually reach out to an external evaluation firm. They exist around the world. They are those individuals that are the experts in evaluation. And that American Evaluators Association I mentioned, well, that actually is a great place to find external evaluators to work with if you've never worked with one before and none of your colleagues have a referral ready to provide you. So there's a few different paths that you might take here, and I wanted to make sure that we covered this portion because it really comes down to capacity for your team, and it's an important budgetary item, whether it's an internal staff or an external partner or organization that we need to take care of. Well, now that we've covered that particular elephant in the room, now we can dig in and talk about quantitative evaluation. So quantitative evaluation, what is it? How is it different than qualitative? When we look at evaluation prompts and questions that are proposed by grant makers, things they ask us to respond, occasionally a grant maker will use these terms, but often they're using broad language asking you to talk about your evaluation of a project or program. It's going to, in most cases, be up to you as an organization to think about whether it's quantitative or qualitative that you'll be putting forward, and to propose your methodologies for measuring your impact, measuring your success for the grant maker. So quantitative data, when we think about what that is, what that type of evaluation means, it's what we're trying to look at for how many, what happened. This is what we can count. We could compare it. There's something, usually a numeric scale, that gives us the ability to compare what happened here versus there. How did we do in this program cohort versus that program cohort? How did we do as a service compared to others in another county or in another state? We're able to make comparisons. We've got empirical data available to us because of what we have counted, the information that we have gathered. So there are numerous ways that nonprofit organizations will gather quantitative data that will then be used for their grant reports, will be the way that they come back to a grant maker and say, here is what we accomplished, here is how we know what we accomplished. Some initial basic methodologies, some tools I should say, that are being used related to quantitative data: sign-in sheets, data logs, activity logs from participants. These are different ways that we're gathering data that we can then aggregate, count, analyze, and make comparisons from. When we think about evaluation and why we might institute a sign-in sheet, why might we start using an activity log? Fill in the blank with any data collection methodology or tool that you are being presented with as a team. And this is going to be something that is more than just your decision as the grant writer. So you're probably going to have your grant team together, the group of colleagues that have a stake in seeing your grant be successful. And if you've got that grant team together, there's likely going to be someone from the program or project that you're talking about as part of the conversation. They've got a seat at the table. So that group should talk about, what is the evaluation's purpose? Why is it that we're going to gather this information, that we're going to collect this data? How is it that we will use the findings? What might we learn that we didn't know before? As a result of this evaluation, is there something that we'll be able to do that we couldn't right now? And how might we make our program, our service, our project, how might we make our offerings better, stronger, so that we're helping our community, we're delivering impact faster or in a different, better way? These are discussion questions, not necessarily that we will provide all the answers to in a grant application narrative, but these are questions that help to unearth the details of what might a quantitative evaluation process look like. Are we doing these evaluations for our best interests, for the right reasons? Are they things that we have the ability to do, the capacity, the expertise to do? Or, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, are we going to maybe need to look outside our four walls and look for some additional resources to get the evaluations done? When we have those questions and that discussion happening in our team setting, without the pressure of the application structure, it makes it easier for us to approach any evaluation prompt that a grant maker might provide us with. Those 5 discussion questions I had up on the previous slide are great conversations to have in advance of sitting down to apply. But if you're sitting down to apply and you've yet to have the opportunity to sit down as a team, what could you do instead? Well, you can look to the specific questions that are important to the grant maker. When they think about transparency and when they think about the way that you report and have accountability for the dollars they've provided, what is important to them? Some grant makers, as I mentioned, will give very generic prompts. Others might give you some very specific questions to address. If you find yourself in a generic situation, they want you to talk about evaluation. You're not quite sure how to talk about your quantitative evaluation. The prompts on the screen right now, this is from a real grant application, might be exactly what you need. These are slightly different than the questions I had on the last slide as prompts for your team. When we think about our quantitative evaluation, we're thinking about the data we're going to gather, the things we can count. Well, which of our anticipated outcomes that we might have had in our logic model, who's going to be responsible for measuring that? And what tool will they be using to measure that outcome? When will that outcome be measured? And why are we measuring it in the way presented? Those, as I mentioned, are slightly different questions than the 5 questions I had for discussion earlier. But these questions can be helpful in drafting a grant narrative about evaluation because it's connecting directly to those program design elements we talked about in an earlier module. They connect us right back to our logic model. And wait a second, if we're talking about responsible people and timelines, I would also expect that we would see our evaluation activities included in our work plan, another one of the program design elements we talked about in that earlier module. This will connect all the dots, okay, at least most of the dots, because it will have connected your logic model and your work plan and your evaluation narrative. We will be talking about the same components, and the grant makers will be able to have a clear picture of what our quantitative evaluation process might be. What will we expect to present? What will be the data they will see after the fact? Now, regardless of what you're counting, how often you're counting it, what tool you're using to gather the data that will be counted, what if your projections, your anticipated outputs, your anticipated outcomes, the data is not showing that you're on track? Things are a little bit off. Why? It might not be anything having to do with your ability to deliver. It might have everything to do with the fact that, gosh, it's been a really snowy winter, and so we haven't been able to offer all the classes, or there have been a lot of snow days, so there haven't been students there for the after-school tutoring program. Life happens, right? Right. But when we're talking about quantitative evaluation and what it is that we'll be gathering for data, what it is that we'll be counting, when we're writing about it within the application, we should also be sure that we let the grant maker know, how are we watching our progress towards our anticipated ultimate outcome? What will we do in terms of a discussion or a corrective action plan if we see along the way that things aren't going quite as expected? Will we pause to analyze our data on an ongoing basis during the grant award period versus only at the end? If we're watching our data along the way, we are less likely to surprise a grant maker at a final report with, well, the data wasn't quite as expected, or it was really different. We don't want to give our grant makers any surprises. So as you're thinking about those questions related to your quantitative evaluation, the data that you're gathering and analyzing, how are you going to use it to show your outcomes that have been achieved? Ask yourself, where in the process are we going to check in on that data? This is another clue, not just for your application narrative, but for your work plan as well. If you go back to that earlier module where we talked about our program design elements, when you look at your evaluation, not only should you have the act of gathering the data and analyzing it at the end in your work plan, I'd encourage you to consider where throughout the grant award period will you be checking in and doing analysis work on that data so that you can make those corrective action plans. Make some tweaks to your program or your project if needed. Well, quantitative evaluation is only one of the two ways that we're going to talk about evaluation. In our next section, we'll be talking about qualitative. But if you have questions as you close out of this module on quantitative, please drop me an email, Diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. Happy to answer your questions at any time, and especially if you have questions before you move on to the next section.